Have you ever had an argument where things escalated? Yelling, name calling, insults, or someone shuts down? Or maybe you just walk away? And then later, after the argument, what actually happens? Typically, not much. No real conversation, no discussion about what just happened, no real understanding. Maybe there's some kind of reunion, and for a moment, things may even seem, and I'm quoting here, great, as if things are great again. Or maybe there's just a lingering distance and that familiar tension, almost like you're waiting for the next escalation to occur. In high conflict relationships, which we've been exploring in this series, this isn't the exception, it's the pattern. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In the last two episodes, we started to take a close look at high conflict relationships, what actually drives them, why arguments escalate so quickly, and what begins to happen beneath the surface when both people feel attacked, dismissed, or pushed out. In part one, we focused on understanding the underlying dynamics, how these interactions are often organized around deeper vulnerabilities, defensive patterns, and each person's attempt to protect their sense of self. And I went into that quite a bit. In part two, we shifted into the moment itself, what you can actually do when things start to escalate, how to slow the interaction down, recognize what's being triggered, and respond in a way that doesn't make things worse. This was about containment, but containing both your own and a loved one's strong emotional state. In this episode, I want to focus on what do you do after the emotional eruption? If you can't come back to those moments, if you can't repair what broke down, you most likely will find yourself having arguments over and over and over again. From the prior episodes, you already have this sort of simple schema in mind. Contain, validate, redirect, return to the task at hand, which I mentioned is what? A productive discussion or conversation. So now, let's look at the next step, and I quote, reconnect. Reconnecting is about rupture, return, reflect, and reconnect. So in other words, reconnect is all of these components, which we'll get into today, which has to do with returning and reflecting. That's the emphasis that I want to put on today's episode. So let's start with the rupture, which I think you know quite well already. Maybe you react to something. Your tone sharpens. You criticize. You judge. You go on the attack. Maybe she withdraws or doubles down, right? She doubles down and calls you controlling, selfish, or turns toward her family for support, as the example we've been following in parts 1 and 2. And now the conversation is broken down. That's the main point of the rupture. And this is where a lot of high conflict couples get stuck. It's not just in the escalation itself, but in what happens next. Because the question now is no longer, how do I manage this moment? Again, something we've been focusing on. The question becomes, how do we come back to something that already went wrong? So let's focus on, and I quote, the return after the rupture, which again is part of the repair. And this is often the hardest part and the most avoided. It's the most important part of the entire process, but it's avoided because it requires a real level of emotional vulnerability. That's what makes it so complicated. In fact, across the research and across different models of working with couples, one finding shows up again and again. Lasting change happens when defensive reactions are replaced with more, hold on to your seat, I'm sorry to say this, with more vulnerable forms of communication. So let's go back to our prototypical example and build this out a little bit further. What we've come to understand so far is that what looks like a simple argument on the surface is actually organized around something much deeper. On the surface, we see his anger, his criticism, his reactivity, the way he goes on the attack. But as we've been exploring, He's not just angry. Emphasis on the word just. He's experiencing himself as replaced, pushed out, like he no longer has a place in the relationship. At the same time, her reaction is not random either. When he becomes critical or aggressive, she doesn't just hear frustration. She experiences herself as alone, overwhelmed, and now being attacked for trying to hold the family together. She's just trying to hold everything together from her perspective. So she responds in the way she knows how, by taking control, organizing the household around her, and turning toward her family for support, sometimes even bringing them in more fully. Again, as we've been describing in these prototypical examples in part 1 and 2, that was about her moving the family in without his consent. So now, let's move into something even more complicated. What does it actually look like to come back after things have already gone wrong? To stay with our example, the argument escalates, things are said, the conversation breaks down, and now there's a distance between them. And I quote, return, again, which is part of the repair, the return begins when one person makes a decision to come back to the interaction differently, not to prove a point, not to win an argument, not to explain yourself, but to understand what actually happened. It might sound something like this. Something happened back there. I think we should go back and try to understand it together. Do you notice what's happening here when I say that? So as he returns, what's different here? In the return, and again, you may have noticed this already, but he's not re-arguing the facts. He's not saying, you misunderstood me, or that's not what I meant, or what I meant was this. Can you understand me now? See, so when he says, let's go back and try to understand it together, he's not trying to convince her of his reality. But in a way, that involves owning your part without immediately defending it. And this is why this is very complicated, because the natural reaction is to defend yourself, to really convince your partner, your loved one, why, they are so aggressive or so narcissistic. But then, in this new way of going back, if you can muster up the courage, it would look something like this. I don't think I handled that very well. See, that involves acknowledging the impact that you had, not just your intent. Like your intent may have been fine, but the impact was quite dramatic. Or, I think the way I said that came across as critical. When I accuse you of making decisions without me, I think it probably came across as critical or like I was attacking you. And I get that because I was angry. You see, so I'm just playing this out, but this is important because from his perspective, he might have been trying to say something like, I felt left out. But the way it was communicated, and in turn, what she experienced was, you're the problem. You see, in other words, he was not yet able. And I said, this is the hard part. It's harder to say, I felt left out than you left me out. And I'm trying to make it the goal. So the goal is to revisit the moment together without getting pulled back into the same argument. So of course that's the goal. So we're going back, that's the return, but we're not going back to argue. We're not going back. We're going back to say, what happened? It needs to sound more like this. What was that like for you when I said that? And then of course she might respond, it felt like you were blaming me again. Like no matter what I do, it's wrong. See, now we're closer to something real. Not the surface argument about decisions or to move the family in, but now you see we're getting closer to internal experiences. Like in other words, I'm failing and I'm being criticized. That's what she's trying to communicate, that's what it constantly feels like. So the focus is no longer on who was right or wrong. The focus is on understanding how the interaction unfolded for both of you. And this is where something new can begin to happen. And that's really at the heart of the return and the repair. Not just coming back, but coming back in a way that allows both people to take accountability, revisit the moment, and begin to build a shared understanding of what happened. Once you can begin to revisit the moment together, something else becomes possible. You can start to step back and see the pattern that both of you keep getting pulled into. And this is really the most important piece of it, okay, is recognizing the pattern. This is really important. So you're not just going back to repair what just happened, which of course you're doing, but you're also changing what happens next. That's the critical piece. Because if you can name the pattern together, and of course, if you can learn from experience, and that's more complicated, and that brings us into a whole psychodynamic dimension, but we're going to hold off on that right now, because what I want to emphasize is if you can name the pattern together, you may be able to recognize it next time before it escalates in the same exact way. So let me show you what it looks like. As the next conversation starts to get tense, which it will, you know this, and it starts to escalate, one of them might wonder, is that thing happening again, where you feel pushed out, like you don't really have a place in family decisions? You see, now you're learning from experience. You're using the prior discussion, the recognition of a pattern, of something that gets triggered, and you're bringing it to the next intense moment. Or let me say this, perhaps even better. If she is in a really reflective state in this prototypical example we're following, she might say something like, I think I did that thing again. Or she might say, did I just do that thing again where I made a family decision without you? You see, that takes a reflective state of mind. And again, some acknowledgement that maybe she did this unintentionally. And then that, of course, would need to be discussed. But the point is, something shifts at this moment. They're no longer just focused on the argument. So it's not just about arguing, but they're connecting the argument to something deeper that keeps repeating itself, if that makes sense. And that's the goal. I mean, that's the point of recognizing the pattern and then learning from experience, making oneself vulnerable, and bringing it to the next argument, or hopefully before it turns into an argument, the next time things begin to get intense. The goal here is not to immediately solve the issue, not to figure out the decision about her family. The goal is to restore the ability to think together. And by the way, this is an example of what I mean when I say focus on the process, not the content. For those of you who have been following along, you hear me say that quite frequently. Focus on the process, not the content. So as soon as things start to escalate, it's like, wait, hold on a second. What happened in this moment? Can we talk about that? When you shift to the process, the goal is to move out of being adversaries, or to move out of that locked, fixed position that you're both in where you play a role, and to move back into what? Two people trying to understand something that's getting reenacted, and I quote, reenacted between them. So I just mentioned the word reenacting, and that's borrowing a little bit from psychodynamic theory. So if we step back and think about this from a psychodynamic perspective, something very important is happening here. During the rupture, that initial phase where things are escalating, each person is no longer seeing the other person accurately. Now, bear with me. I know sometimes this stuff gets just a little bit more complicated. I can't help myself, but I just want to add this little piece in just to give you an example of how complex these things are. So during the rupture, you're not seeing the other accurately. This couple, for instance, is relating to the internal version of the other person. He is not, in other words, just responding to her. Now, of course, in part, there is a reality. Again, you may have heard me say, these things always have one foot in the present and one foot in the past. But in this moment, he's not just responding to her. He's responding to an experience of being displaced, irrelevant, and secondary. She, on the other hand, is not just responding to him. She's responding to an experience of being alone, overwhelmed, and criticized. And once those internal experiences take over, the interaction organizes around defensive maneuvers. He attacks her because he needs to reassert himself. In other words, so this way he's not left out, he's not disappearing. And she controls. She withdraws. She does this to stabilize her own sense of self, or she retreats to her family to feel supported. So the rupture is not just a breakdown in communication. That's why this stuff, again, it happens on multiple levels. And that's why just giving somebody communication skills is not always effective, because there's this whole internal world, these inner dynamics that are going on, what we call representations of oneself and others, that also get mixed up in these high conflict dynamics. It's a moment where each person loses access to the other as a separate mind. This is very much in line. This is a renowned psychoanalyst, Peter Fonagy. This is what he describes as a collapse, and I quote, in mentalization, where certainty increases, curiosity disappears, and each person becomes convinced of their own version of reality. That, again, is the collapse in mentalization. So what I'm encouraging you to think about now is repair is not just, and I quote, being nice or talking it through, which is part of it, of course. Repair is the process of restoring the capacity to think about the other person as a separate being, as a separate person. They're separate from your own internal experience. For example, when he says, what was that like for you? In other words, I mentioned that earlier. Remember when he got angry? And he's trying to start to imagine, what was that like for you? He's reintroducing at that moment curiosity, uncertainty, he doesn't know, and a recognition of her subjectivity. In other words, she has her own experience of him. When he says, I think I came across as critical, he is taking back a projection and beginning to own his own impact on her. That's much more than just managing or repairing this one conflict. This is really the deeper nature of the work with high conflict couples. The goal is to build and gradually increase the capacity to hold both your own and a loved one's perspective, their feelings, and their internal experience in mind. So two things have to happen at once. You have to hold on to your own subjectivity and to a loved one's subjectivity. And while we touched on some of these core pieces here, this is a complex process, one that takes time, repetition, and a willingness to come back to these moments differently. That's the return that I've been describing, to come back to them with a certain level of vulnerability and a real effort to repair. This seems like a good place to pause, but I'll leave you with this final thought. When you could begin to return, reflect, and think together, the interaction no longer has to organize itself around defense, and something new can begin to take shape. There's still so much more to say about this, but we have to stop here for now. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.